The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees surrounding Riverside Elementary as Mrs. Chen grabbed her car keys from the kitchen counter. Something had been bothering her for weeks now. Her usually cheerful 10-year-old son hadn't been himself lately. He'd been quieter, picking at his dinner, and making excuses to stay home from school. At first, she thought it might be a phase or perhaps he was coming down with something. But last night, when she noticed him secretly packing extra snacks into his backpack, her maternal instincts kicked into high gear. Her son had always been content with the lunch she packed him every morning. Why the sudden change? Working as a nurse at the local hospital had taught Mrs. Chen to trust her gut feelings. She had the afternoon shift today, which meant her morning was free. Without telling anyone, she decided to pay a surprise visit to her son's school during lunch hour. She wanted to see firsthand what might be troubling her little boy. The drive to school was filled with worry. Was he being bullied? Were other kids making fun of the traditional Chinese lunches she sometimes packed? Her mind raced with possibilities as she pulled into the visitors' parking lot. The school secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, greeted her with a warm smile as she signed in at the front office. "Your son's class should be heading to lunch in about 10 minutes, Mrs. Rodriguez informed her, handing over a visitor's badge. "Would you like me to call him down to the office?" Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Actually, I'd like to surprise him in the cafeteria, if that's okay. I've been worried about him lately." The secretary's smile faltered slightly, and something flickered in her eyes. Was it concern? But before Mrs. Chen could ask about it, Mrs. Rodriguez had already nodded and directed her toward the cafeteria. As she walked down the familiar hallway decorated with student artwork and science fair projects, Mrs. Chen heard the growing buzz of children's voices. She paused outside the cafeteria doors, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. Through the small window, she could see groups of students filing in, their lunch boxes and paper bags in hand. Her son's class was among them, and she spotted him near the middle of the line, shoulders slightly hunched, clutching his Batman lunchbox. But instead of heading to the usual tables, she noticed his class being directed to a separate area near the back of the cafeteria. Curious, she waited until most of the students had settled before quietly pushing open the door. The scene that unfolded before her eyes made her blood run cold. Her son's teacher, Mrs. Walsh, was systematically going through each student's lunch. But this wasn't a routine check, she was actually taking items from their lunches and replacing them with different foods. Mrs. Chen watched in disbelief as the teacher approached her son's spot. "Remember our deal," she heard Mrs. Walsh say in a low voice. "This is for your own good." Her son's shoulders slumped further as he wordlessly opened his lunchbox. Mrs. Walsh quickly swooped in, removing the carefully packed dumplings Mrs. Chen had made that morning. In their place, she put what appeared to be a pre-packaged sandwich. The other children at the table sat quietly, their own modified lunches in front of them. Some were picking listlessly at unfamiliar foods, while others simply stared at their trays. The joy and chatter typical of elementary school lunch periods was noticeably absent from this corner of the cafeteria. Mrs. Chen felt her hands trembling with a mixture of shock and anger. This explained everything: the sudden change in her son's behavior, the secret snack packing, the loss of appetite at dinner. How long had this been going on? How many other children were affected? She watched as Mrs. Walsh moved on to the next student, performing the same lunch swap with practiced efficiency. The teacher's actions seemed almost mechanical, as if she'd done this countless times before. Each time she approached a student, they would silently comply, their small faces showing a mix of resignation and disappointment. In that moment, Mrs. Chen realized this wasn't just about her son, this was systematic. She noticed other details too, how some students tried to hide certain lunch items, how others had already started bringing generic store-bought foods, perhaps hoping to avoid the swaps altogether. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a dystopian novel rather than an elementary school cafeteria. Her maternal protective instincts warred with her professional training to remain calm and assess situations objectively. As a nurse, she knew the importance of proper nutrition and cultural dietary preferences. As a mother, she felt violated. Her right to feed her child what she deemed appropriate had been stripped away without her knowledge or consent. The sound of a lunchbox snapping shut brought her attention back to her son. He was now staring at the replacement sandwich with the same dejected expression she'd seen at home. A few seats away, another student was discreetly trying to wrap up some untouched food, presumably to take home, just as her son had been doing. Mrs. Chen took another deep breath, her mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? What gave Mrs. Walsh the authority to make these decisions? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone spoken up about this before? She glanced around the cafeteria, noting how the other lunch tables were full of happy, chattering students enjoying their meals. The contrast with this segregated group was stark and troubling. It seemed this special treatment was reserved for specific students, though the criteria for selection wasn't immediately apparent. As she continued to observe, Mrs. Walsh finished her rounds and settled at a small desk near the group, pulling out her own lunch while keeping a watchful eye on the students. The teacher's casual attitude about the whole situation made it even more disturbing. This wasn't a one-time occurrence or a special circumstance. This was an established routine. Mrs. Chen's fingers gripped her visitor's badge tightly as she weighed her options. She could confront Mrs. Walsh right now, in front of everyone. She could march straight to the principal's office and demand an explanation. Or she could document everything she was seeing and build a stronger case before taking action. Years of handling difficult situations in the emergency room had taught her the value of staying calm and gathering all the facts before acting. But as she watched her son half-heartedly bite into the replacement sandwich, she felt her professional composure cracking. This wasn't just about lunch anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and the trust between educators and families. It was about children being taught to silently accept authority even when it violated their personal boundaries. It was about the subtle message being sent to these students about their own cultural identities and their families' choices. Mrs. Chen knew one thing for certain: this would be the last day any child in this school would have their lunch taken away without their parents' knowledge. The question was, what would be the most effective way to ensure that change happened? As Mrs. Chen stood there processing everything she had witnessed, a small commotion caught her attention. A new student had just entered the cafeteria, clearly late to lunch. The young girl, probably around 7 years old, clutched a bright purple lunch bag decorated with unicorn stickers. Her eyes darted nervously around the room until Mrs. Walsh spotted her and beckoned her over to the segregated area. The girl's face fell as she approached the table, and Mrs. Chen recognized the same look of dread she'd seen on her own son's face that morning. But unlike the other students who had surrendered their lunches without protest, this little girl held her purple bag closer to her chest as Mrs. Walsh approached. I promised my grandma I'd eat everything she made, the girl said in a trembling voice. She made it special because I got an A on my spelling test. Mrs. Walsh's expression hardened slightly. Now, sweetie, we've talked about this. Remember our discussion about proper nutrition? Your grandmother means well, but... The girl's eyes welled up with tears. But she made her special rice pudding. She only makes it for special occasions. Something in Mrs. Chen snapped. Before Mrs. Walsh could respond to the girl, she stepped forward, her nurse's shoes squeaking slightly on the polished cafeteria floor. Every head at the table turned toward her, including her son's, whose eyes widened in surprise and what looked like embarrassment. Mrs. Walsh, Mrs. Chen said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I believe we need to have a conversation about what's happening here. The teacher straightened up, quickly composing herself. Mrs. Chen, what a surprise. I wasn't aware you were visiting today. Clearly, Mrs. Chen replied, moving to stand beside the girl with the purple lunch bag. She placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. "Please, enjoy your grandmother's special lunch, sweetheart. You earned it." The girl looked uncertainly between Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Walsh before scurrying to an empty seat, clutching her lunch bag like a lifeline. Mrs. Walsh's face flushed red. "Mrs. Chen, I understand this might seem concerning, but I assure you there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Perhaps we should discuss this privately?" "I think we're well past private discussions," Mrs. Chen responded, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Other students had started to notice the tension, and the usual cafeteria chatter began to dim. "I want to know exactly why you're confiscating children's lunches without parental knowledge or consent." Mrs. Walsh glanced nervously at the growing number of curious onlookers. "I'm simply trying to ensure all students have access to proper nutrition. Some of these ethnic foods." "Ethnic foods?" Mrs. Chen interrupted, her voice sharp. "You mean the foods that represent our family's cultures and traditions? The meals we carefully prepare to nourish our children and connect them to their heritage?" By now, the cafeteria had grown unusually quiet. Even the lunch ladies had stopped serving to watch the confrontation. Mrs. Chen noticed her son shrinking in his seat, but she also saw other students sitting up straighter, some pulling their modified lunches closer, as if finally given permission to protect them. "The school has a responsibility," Mrs. Walsh began, but Mrs. Chen held up her hand. "The school has a responsibility to respect its students and their families. Where is this food going? The food you're taking from our children?" Mrs. Walsh's silence spoke volumes. Mrs. Chen turned to address the entire table of students. "Has anyone's parents been informed about these lunch changes?" A chorus of quiet no's followed. One brave student raised his hand. "My mom keeps asking why I'm still hungry after school. I was scared to tell her." Another student chimed in. "My dad spends extra time making my lunch because I have allergies. Mrs. Walsh says his food choices aren't balanced, but he's a nutritionist." The floodgates had opened. More students began sharing their experiences, their voices growing stronger with each confession. Mrs. Chen listened, carefully noting each detail, her medical training kicking in as she documented the pattern of behavior in her mind. A sudden movement caught her attention. Mrs. Walsh was trying to quietly slip away from the scene. "Please stay, Mrs. Walsh," Mrs. Chen called out. "I'm sure the principal would love to hear your explanation as well." As if on cue, the cafeteria doors swung open, and the principal, Mr. Patel, walked in. The unusual quiet had apparently drawn his attention. He surveyed the scene with confusion, taking in the separate table, the modified lunches, and the obvious tension in the air. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Walsh. "I was just about to call you," Mrs. Chen said calmly. "We need to discuss an unauthorized lunch modification program that's been operating in your school. One that specifically targets certain students." Mr. Patel's expression shifted from confusion to concern as he looked more closely at the segregated table. "Mrs. Walsh, is this true?" The teacher's composure finally cracked. "I was trying to help. These children need to learn proper American eating habits. Their unusual lunches make them stand out. I'm trying to help them fit in better." A collective gasp rose from the students and staff who were listening. Mrs. Chen felt her hands shake with renewed anger, but her voice remained steady. "By teaching them to be ashamed of their cultural identity? By making them hide their family's food traditions? By hungry?" The principal's face had grown increasingly grave as he listened. "Mrs. Walsh, please come with me to my office immediately." He turned to Mrs. Chen. "Would you join us as well? We need to fully understand the scope of this situation." Mrs. Chen nodded, but before following them, she turned to the students at the table. "Please, everyone, enjoy your original lunches. And tonight, tell your parents what's been happening. They need to know." As she watched, students began retrieving their original lunch items from various hiding spots, under napkins, in their backpacks, tucked into paper bags. Her son caught her eye and gave her a small, grateful smile as he pulled out the container of dumplings he'd managed to hide before Mrs. Walsh could take them. The principal was waiting by the cafeteria doors. As Mrs. Chen walked toward him, she heard the blessed sound of children's chatter returning to normal volume, punctuated by the opening of lunch boxes and the sharing of food stories that had been silenced for too long. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as she followed Mr. Patel to his office, Mrs. Chen felt a sense of purpose. Sometimes it took just one person speaking up to break the silence. Now it was time to ensure this never happened again, not to any child in any school. The walk to the principal's office felt like the longest journey of Mrs. Chen's nursing career. The hallways were empty now, but the emotional weight of what she'd just witnessed in the cafeteria made each step feel heavier than the last. Behind her, Mrs. Walsh's heels clicked against the linoleum floor, an irregular rhythm that suggested the teacher's nervousness. Inside the office, Mr. Patel gestured for them both to sit. His secretary appeared with a notepad, ready to document everything. The principal's face was stern as he settled behind his desk, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by professional gravity. "Mrs. Walsh," he began, "I need you to explain exactly what's been happening in my school's cafeteria. How long has this been going on?" The teacher shifted in her seat, smoothing her skirt repeatedly, a nervous gesture that didn't escape Mrs. Chen's notice. "It started about 2 months ago," Mrs. Walsh admitted. "I noticed some students weren't socializing during lunch. They seemed isolated." "Because you separated them," Mrs. Chen interjected, her voice tight with controlled anger. No, you don't understand," Mrs. Walsh protested. "They were already sitting apart. The other children would make comments about their lunches, about the smell or appearance of their food. I thought if I could help them adapt to more standard options, it would help them integrate better." Mr. Patel leaned forward, his expression darkening. "So instead of addressing the students making inappropriate comments, you decided to punish the children being targeted?" Mrs. Walsh's face flushed. "I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting them. Children can be cruel, and these cultural differences are what make our school community rich and vibrant," Mr. Patel interrupted. "Mrs. Walsh, do you realize that what you've done goes against everything our school's diversity and inclusion policy stands for?" As they talked, Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. She found what she was looking for, pictures from the school's International Food Day celebration just last spring. "Interesting," she said, holding up her phone. "Here's a photo of you, Mrs. Walsh, praising my son's grandmother for bringing in traditional Chinese dumplings for the school celebration. You called them a wonderful addition to our multicultural community." The teacher's face reddened further. That was different. That was a special event. So our cultural food is only acceptable when it serves as entertainment? Mrs. Chen's voice was quiet but sharp. But for everyday life, we should hide it away? What message does that send to our children? The secretary's pen scratched rapidly across her notepad as Mr. Patel rubbed his temples. "Mrs. Walsh, where are the confiscated food items now?" A long silence followed. Finally, Mrs. Walsh spoke in a small voice. "I've been disposing of them." The revelation hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Chen thought of all the carefully prepared meals, the love and tradition packed into each lunchbox, thrown away like trash. She thought of her son, hungry and ashamed, trying to hide his distress from her. The weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "Do you have any idea," she said slowly, "how many families in our school community have experienced food insecurity? How many grandparents and parents put aside their own needs to ensure their children have proper lunches? And you've been throwing their sacrifices in the garbage." Mr. Patel held up a hand as Mrs. Walsh began to protest again. This is a serious breach of trust and professional conduct. We'll need to contact the school board immediately. And every single parent whose child has been affected must be notified." A knock at the office door interrupted them. The school counselor, Dr. Rivera, stepped in, her face concerned. "I apologize for interrupting, but I think you need to hear this. After what happened in the cafeteria, several students came to my office. They've been sharing stories that go beyond lunch monitoring." Mrs. Chen's heart sank as Dr. Rivera continued. "Some students report being told to speak only English during lunch period. Others say they've been discouraged from sharing or trading lunch items with their friends, a common social interaction that helps build relationships. One student even mentioned being told their mother's notes, written in Korean, shouldn't be included in their lunchbox." Mr. Patel's expression grew increasingly troubled as he listened. "Mrs. Walsh, these are serious allegations of cultural suppression. This goes far beyond lunch monitoring, this is systematic discrimination." The teacher had grown pale, her earlier defensiveness replaced by evident worry. "I never meant. I was trying to help them assimilate." "Assimilate?" Mrs. Chen couldn't hold back anymore. "My son is a third-generation American. He plays baseball, loves superhero movies, and can quote every episode of his favorite cartoons. He doesn't need to assimilate, he needs to be allowed to embrace all parts of his identity, including his cultural heritage." Dr. Rivera nodded in agreement. "Research shows that children who are encouraged to maintain connections to their cultural heritage while participating in the broader community show better academic performance and stronger social-emotional development." As the professionals continued discussing the implications, Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Word had spread quickly through the parent community. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, all were reaching out, sharing similar stories they'd heard from their children but hadn't fully understood until now. One message particularly caught her attention. "My daughter came home crying last week because she was told her grandmother's enchiladas weren't appropriate lunch food. I thought she was just going through a picky eating phase. I had no idea." Mr. Patel was already on his phone with the school board superintendent, scheduling an emergency meeting. Dr. Rivera was outlining plans for classroom discussions about cultural respect and diversity. The secretary had filled several pages with notes. But Mrs. Chen's thoughts were with the children still in the cafeteria. Today, they'd seen an adult stand up against injustice. They'd watched their cultural heritage being defended. They'd witnessed the power of speaking truth to authority. "We need to address the students," she said, interrupting the ongoing discussions. "Not just the ones directly affected, but the entire school. They need to understand why this was wrong and how we move forward." Mr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Dr. Rivera, could you work with our teachers to develop age-appropriate discussions about respect for different cultures and the importance of standing up against discrimination?" As they began planning the school's response, Mrs. Chen received another message, this one from her son. "Mom, kids at other tables are asking to try my dumplings. Is it okay if I share?" For the first time since this all began, Mrs. Chen smiled. Sometimes it took a crisis to create an opportunity for real change. The lunch period was nearly over, but the conversations sparked by today's events were just beginning. By the time the final school bell rang that afternoon, the story had spread far beyond Riverside Elementary's walls. Parents arriving for pickup found their phones buzzing with messages from a hastily formed community chat group. The usual quiet of the parking lot was replaced by clusters of concerned parents sharing stories they'd just heard from their children. Mrs. Chen had planned to head straight to her nursing shift at the hospital, but seeing the gathering crowd, she knew her day wasn't over yet. She spotted her son walking out with two of his classmates, their faces animated as they talked. For the first time in weeks, he was walking tall, no longer trying to make himself invisible. "Mom," he called out, running up to her. Tommy and Raj want to know if they can come over sometime. I told them about how Grandma teaches me to make dumplings on weekends." Before she could respond, Tommy's mother approached, her eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Chen. I'm Lisa, Tommy's mom. I just wanted to say thank you. My son just told me he's been throwing away the lunches I pack him for the past month because Mrs. Walsh said his gluten-free foods made him too different." Her voice cracked. "He has celiac disease. It's not a choice." More parents began gathering around, each with their own story to share. A father talked about his daughter's diabetes-friendly meals being replaced. Another mother spoke of her son's kosher lunches being dismissed as too restrictive. The stories poured out, each one revealing a new layer to Mrs. Walsh's actions. Mr. Patel emerged from the school, looking tired but determined. He'd spent the afternoon in emergency meetings with the school board and was now ready to address the parent community. The crowd quieted as he raised his hands. "First, I want to apologize," he began, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "What happened in our school was unacceptable. We've failed not just as educators, but as guardians of your children's well-being. Tomorrow morning, we'll be holding a special assembly to address this with all students. But right now, I want to hear from you, our parent community." The next hour turned the parking lot into an impromptu town hall. Parents brought up concerns beyond just the lunch incident, subtle discriminations they'd noticed but hadn't quite pieced together. The school's diversity committee, which had been mostly ceremonial, suddenly had a line of parents wanting to join. A local news van pulled up, drawn by the unusual gathering. Mrs. Chen watched as parents debated whether to speak to the reporter. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the school secretary, who stepped forward first. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted to the group. "I saw children coming to the office with stomach aches every day after lunch. I noticed the pattern but didn't push hard enough to uncover why. We all need to do better at speaking up." The reporter listened intently, taking notes but keeping a respectful distance. This wasn't just another sensational story, it was a community coming to terms with how silence and inaction had allowed discrimination to flourish. In the midst of the discussions, Mrs. Chen felt a tug on her sleeve. It was the little girl with the purple unicorn lunch bag from earlier. Her grandmother stood beside her, looking concerned. "Is it true?" the grandmother asked in heavily accented English. "My granddaughter finally told me her rice pudding was being taken away. I thought she just didn't like my cooking anymore." Her voice trembled. "I've been making simpler foods, trying to make them more American." Mrs. Chen reached out and squeezed the older woman's hand. "Your food is part of her heritage, her connection to you. That's something to be celebrated, not hidden." The little girl hugged her grandmother tightly. "I love your rice pudding, Nanny. It's the best thing ever." Nearby, a group of parents had started organizing. One mother, a nutritionist, offered to give a presentation about different cultural approaches to healthy eating. Another parent, who ran a local restaurant, suggested hosting a monthly international food festival in the school cafeteria. "Our differences aren't obstacles to overcome," she declared. "They're opportunities to learn from each other." Mr. Patel was noting down every suggestion, his earlier exhaustion replaced by renewed energy. The school board representatives who had arrived for the emergency meeting now stood with him, witnessing the community's response. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Mrs. Chen checked her watch. Her hospital shift would be starting soon, but something more important needed to be addressed first. "What about tomorrow?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard above the crowd. "What happens when our children return to school?" The question brought a hush over the gathering. Mr. Patel stepped forward again. "Tomorrow will be different," he assured them. "We're implementing immediate changes. No child will be separated during lunch. No food will be confiscated. We're bringing in counselors to help students process what's happened, and we're organizing cultural awareness training for all staff." A parent raised her hand. "And Mrs. Walsh?" "She has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation," Mr. Patel replied firmly. "The school board will be reviewing all complaints and taking appropriate action." As parents began dispersing, making plans to meet again and share contact information, Mrs. Chen's son tugged at her arm. "Mom, are you still mad about what happened?" She knelt down to his level, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I'm not mad anymore, honey. I'm proud of you for being strong, proud of your friends for standing together, proud of our community for speaking up." He smiled, then looked serious. "Some kids were saying Mrs. Walsh might not come back to school. Sometimes," Mrs. Chen said carefully, "the best thing we can do is learn from our mistakes and make sure they don't happen again. That's true for everyone, teachers included." As they walked to their car, Mrs. Chen noticed small groups of students and parents still talking, sharing snacks from lunch boxes that had been hidden away all day. The fear and shame that had hung over the school cafeteria was being replaced by something stronger: pride, understanding, and a commitment to change. She might be late for her hospital shift, but as a nurse, Mrs. Chen knew that some wounds needed immediate attention. Today, they had begun the healing process for their entire school community. The real work would start tomorrow, but for now, watching her son chat excitedly about sharing his grandmother's cooking with his friends, she knew they were on the right path. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but the atmosphere at Riverside Elementary was anything but normal. News vans lined the street, their early morning crews setting up cameras and microphones. Parents walked their children to the entrance, many carrying lunch boxes that seemed more elaborate than usual, a quiet act of defiance against yesterday's revelations. Mrs. Chen had taken the morning off from the hospital again, determined to see how the school would handle this crucial day. Her son clutched his lunchbox proudly. This morning, they'd packed it together, filling it with a mix of traditional Chinese dishes and his favorite American snacks. His choice, his identity, his way of sharing both worlds he belonged to. Inside the school, the transformation was already visible. The cafeteria tables had been rearranged, eliminating the segregated section that had become a symbol of discrimination. Colorful posters about cultural diversity and respect lined the walls, hastily but thoughtfully put up by teachers who had arrived early. The morning assembly brought the entire school together in the gymnasium. Mr. Patel stood on the stage, flanked by Dr. Rivera and several school board members. But it was the presence of the students themselves that commanded attention, particularly those who had been affected by Mrs. Walsh's actions. "Today," Mr. Patel began, his voice gentle but firm, "we're going to talk about something very important. We're going to talk about respect, about celebrating our differences, and about the courage it takes to speak up when something is wrong." Dr. Rivera stepped forward, holding up a world map. "Every person in this room has a story," she said. "Every lunchbox that comes into our cafeteria carries more than just food, it carries family traditions, cultural heritage, and love. Today, we're going to learn about those stories." What followed was unlike any school assembly before. Students were invited to come up and point to their families' countries of origin on the map. They shared brief stories about their favorite foods, their grandparents' recipes, their family traditions. Even children whose families had been in America for generations spoke about their regional specialties and family cooking traditions. Mrs. Chen's son surprised her by volunteering to go up. "My grandma teaches me to make dumplings every weekend," he said into the microphone, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "She says every fold in the dumpling is like a little hug for the person who's going to eat it. I didn't want to share before because I was scared people would think it was weird. But it's not weird, it's special." The applause that followed his words brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes. Other parents who had stayed for the assembly were similarly moved, watching their children find their voices and their pride. A group of fifth graders presented a spontaneous idea they developed, a weekly cultural exchange during lunch period, where students could voluntarily share and swap small portions of their home-packed meals. Like a tiny food festival, one student explained, so we can learn about each other through food. Mr. Patel approved the idea on the spot, with the addition of proper food safety guidelines and allergy considerations. The school nurse stepped up to help develop protocols that would make the exchanges both safe and inclusive. As the assembly continued, Mrs. Chen received a text message from the hospital's administration. They had seen the morning news coverage and were fully supporting her impromptu time off. More than that, they were interested in developing a community health program about cultural nutrition and wellness, inspired by the events at Riverside Elementary. The school day proceeded with a mix of regular classes and special discussions about cultural awareness. Teachers had been briefed on how to handle questions and concerns, and many incorporated impromptu lessons about diversity into their regular subjects. In math class, students solved problems involving recipes from different cultures. The art teacher had students design posters celebrating their favorite family meals. By lunchtime, the cafeteria had transformed into a buzzing cultural exchange. Children who had once hidden their lunches now proudly opened their lunch boxes. The air was filled with questions and explanations, with students eagerly learning about each other's foods and traditions. Mrs. Chen watched as her son shared his dumplings with his friends, explaining each ingredient with the same enthusiasm his grandmother had shown while teaching him. Nearby, the little girl with the purple unicorn lunch bag was letting her friends taste her grandmother's rice pudding, her face beaming with pride. The local news crews had been allowed to film brief segments of the lunch period, capturing what the reporter called remarkable example of turning a negative situation into an opportunity for growth and understanding. But more important than the media coverage was the genuine change visible in the students' interactions. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Chen met with the newly formed Parent Advisory Committee. The group was diverse, representing many different cultural backgrounds and dietary needs. They were working on guidelines to prevent any future incidents of food-based discrimination while promoting cultural exchange and understanding. It's not just about the food, one parent pointed out. It's about teaching our children to be proud of who they are and respectful of others. It's about creating a school environment where everyone feels valued. The committee discussed plans for monthly cultural celebration days, cooking workshops where parents and grandparents could share their traditional recipes, and educational programs about different dietary requirements, from religious restrictions to medical needs. They were determined to turn this challenging experience into lasting positive change. As the meeting wound down, Dr. Rivera shared some observations from her conversations with students throughout the day. The most powerful thing, she said, is seeing how quickly children embrace diversity when given the chance. They're naturally curious and accepting. We adults just need to create the right environment for that acceptance to flourish. Mr. Patel added that several other schools in the district had reached out, wanting to learn from Riverside's experience and implement similar cultural awareness programs. What had started as one mother's discovery of lunchtime discrimination was sparking changes that would affect thousands of students. Before leaving for her evening hospital shift, Mrs. Chen stopped by her son's classroom. He was finishing an assignment, an essay about his favorite family tradition. The words, "making dumplings with grandma," were written across the top of his paper in proud, careful letters. "Mom," he said, looking up from his work, "Tommy's mom invited us over for dinner next week. She wants Grandma to teach her how to make dumplings. And Tommy's going to show me how to make his family's special gluten-free pizza. Is that okay?" Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering how just days ago, her son had been hiding his lunch and making excuses to stay home. Now he was eager to share his culture and learn about others. Sometimes, she realized, the worst situations could lead to the most beautiful transformations. 1 week had passed since the confrontation in the cafeteria, and the changes at Riverside Elementary were becoming more visible with each passing day. The morning sun streamed through the cafeteria windows, illuminating a space that had been transformed not just physically, but spiritually. Mrs. Chen sat in on the morning parent committee meeting before her hospital shift, amazed at how much had been accomplished in just 7 days. The walls now displayed student-made posters celebrating different cuisines from around the world. A new bulletin board titled Our Food Stories showcased photos of families cooking together, with small write-ups about their traditional dishes and what made them special. The response has been overwhelming, Mr. Patel reported to the committee. 3 other schools in the district have already adopted our new cultural food awareness program. And yesterday, I received a call from the State Board of Education. They want to use Riverside as a model for developing statewide guidelines on cultural sensitivity in schools. But it wasn't just the official changes that were making a difference. The real transformation was happening among the students themselves. During her visit, Mrs. Chen watched as children naturally grouped and regrouped during lunch, sharing stories and snacks across cultural lines that had once seemed impossible to bridge. Her son had become something of a lunchtime diplomat, helping to organize what the kids were calling Taste Adventure Tuesday, a voluntary lunch-sharing program that had quickly become the highlight of the week. Today, he was explaining to his friends how his grandmother used different shapes for dumplings to tell them apart: round for pork, crescent for vegetables, triangle for shrimp. The little girl with the purple unicorn lunch bag, whose name was Priya, Mrs. Chen had learned, had set up a dessert dictionary with her friends, where they kept track of sweet treats from different cultures. Her grandmother's rice pudding had earned 5 stars in their rating system, and several parents had requested the recipe. During the parent committee meeting, Lisa, Tommy's mother, shared some unexpected positive outcomes. The focus on food awareness has actually helped with bullying in general, she explained. When children understand why some of their classmates eat differently, whether it's for cultural, religious, or medical reasons, they become more accepting of all kinds of differences. Dr. Rivera, who had been monitoring the psychological impact of the changes, agreed. We're seeing a ripple effect. Students who were once hesitant to share other aspects of their culture, like traditional clothing or holiday celebrations, are now feeling more confident. It's as if the food conversation opened the door to a broader dialogue about identity and acceptance. The school nurse added that reports of stomach aches and missed lunches had dropped to almost 0. Children are actually eating their lunches now, not hiding them or throwing them away. The impact on their physical and emotional well-being is remarkable. But the most surprising development came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen received an email that morning from Mrs. Walsh herself. The former teacher had been attending cultural sensitivity training and doing deep reflection on her actions. Her email was thoughtful and remorseful. I realized that in my misguided attempt to help children fit in, I was actually teaching them to be ashamed of their identities. Watching the positive changes at Riverside has been both humbling and educational. While I understand I can't undo the harm I've caused, I want to learn and do better. The school board was reviewing Mrs. Walsh's case, but the incident had sparked a district-wide review of cultural competency training for all staff members. Teachers were now required to attend workshops on cultural sensitivity and inclusive education practices. The local community had embraced the movement as well. Restaurants near the school began offering heritage menu specials, featuring traditional recipes shared by students' families. The public library started a monthly cooking demonstration series where parents and grandparents could share their culinary traditions with the community. Mrs. Chen's hospital had even gotten involved, developing a new program called Healing Through Heritage that emphasized the importance of culturally appropriate nutrition in patient care. She had been asked to lead the initiative, drawing on her experience both as a nurse and as a mother who had stood up against food-based discrimination. During lunch period, she watched as a group of students huddled around a table, deeply engaged in what looked like a serious discussion. As she approached, she realized they were planning the upcoming International Food Festival, the first of what would become an annual school event. "We need to make sure everyone feels included," one student was saying, carefully writing in a notebook. Like, we should have signs that show what ingredients are in each dish, so kids with allergies know what they can try. Another student chimed in, and we should have cards that tell the story behind each food. My mom says every recipe has a story. The level of thoughtfulness and empathy these young students were showing brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes. They weren't just planning a food festival, they were creating a space where everyone's culture and needs would be respected and celebrated. Later that afternoon, as she prepared to leave for her shift at the hospital, Mrs. Chen stopped by Mr. Patel's office. The principal was on the phone with yet another school district interested in learning from Riverside's experience. You know, he said after ending the call, when you first discovered what was happening in our cafeteria, it felt like a crisis. But sometimes it takes a crisis to show us where we need to grow. Your courage in speaking up didn't just change our school, it's changing how schools everywhere think about cultural respect and inclusion. Mrs. Chen thought about her son, who now walked the school halls with confidence, proud of both his American identity and his Chinese heritage. She thought about Priya, who had started teaching her friends to make simple Indian desserts during weekend playdates. She thought about Tommy, who no longer had to hide his gluten-free meals or feel ashamed of being different. The children taught us as much as we taught them, she replied. They just needed adults brave enough to stand up and create a safe space for them to be themselves. As she walked to her car, she passed the cafeteria one last time. Through the windows, she could see the afternoon snack program in session. Students were sitting in mixed groups, sharing food and stories, their laughter carrying through the glass. The scene was beautifully ordinary, exactly as it should have been all along. 1 month after the cafeteria incident, Riverside Elementary was hosting its first International Food Festival. The school grounds had been transformed into a vibrant celebration of culture and community. Colorful banners hung from every corner, each designed by students to represent different cultural traditions. The autumn air was filled with the mingled aromas of dishes from around the world. Mrs. Chen stood at the entrance, helping to welcome families as they arrived. She could hardly believe how much had changed in just 4 weeks. What had started as a mother's concern for her son had blossomed into something far bigger than she could have imagined. The school gymnasium had been converted into a massive community dining hall, with tables arranged in a way that encouraged mixing and mingling. Each table had been decorated by students with facts about different cultures and customs, along with conversation starter cards to help people connect over their shared love of food and family traditions. "Mom, come quick," her son called, tugging at her sleeve. "Grandma's dumpling making demonstration is about to start." In the cooking demonstration area, her mother had set up a station where she would teach interested parents and children the art of dumpling making. The sight of her mother, standing proudly in her apron, ready to share her cultural heritage, brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes. Just weeks ago, these same dumplings had been deemed inappropriate for school lunch. The demonstration area had been carefully planned to be inclusive. Each cooking station had clear ingredient lists posted, and alternative options were available for those with dietary restrictions. Tommy's mother had a station nearby, showing how to make traditional recipes gluten-free without losing their cultural authenticity. Priya and her grandmother had drawn a huge crowd at their dessert station, where they were teaching people how to make rice pudding. The little girl's purple unicorn lunch bag sat proudly displayed on their table, now covered in pins and badges representing all the different cultural desserts she had tried and documented in her dessert dictionary. Mr. Patel moved through the crowd, accompanied by representatives from the State Board of Education. They were documenting everything, not just the event itself, but the process that had led to this transformation. Riverside's journey was being developed into a case study for other schools, a template for turning a challenging situation into an opportunity for growth and change. Dr. Rivera had set up a storytelling corner where families could record their food memories and cultural traditions. The stories would be compiled into a book that would be placed in the school library, ensuring that future generations of students would understand and appreciate the rich cultural heritage of their school community. Mrs. Chen, a familiar voice, called out. She turned to see Mrs. Walsh standing hesitantly at the entrance. The former teacher had been invited as part of the healing process, after showing genuine remorse and commitment to learning from her mistakes. She was carrying a covered dish. "I brought my grandmother's Irish soda bread," Mrs. Walsh said softly. "I realized I had never shared my own cultural heritage with the students. I was so focused on what I thought was normal, that I forgot every family has their own story to tell." Mrs. Chen helped her find a place at one of the tables, watching as students gradually approached, curious about the bread and its history. It was a small step, but an important one in the ongoing journey of understanding and reconciliation. The festival had drawn attention from beyond the school community. Local news stations were covering the event, but more importantly, educators from other districts had come to learn. They walked around with notepads, taking pictures and notes, asking questions about how they could implement similar programs in their own schools. A group of middle school students from a nearby district had set up a booth showcasing their new cultural exchange club, which they had started after hearing about Riverside's story. They were leading activities that helped younger children understand and celebrate different cultural traditions. In the center of the gymnasium, a large world map had been placed on the floor. Throughout the day, families would stand on their countries of origin, creating a living representation of the school's diversity. Lines of yarn connected these points to a central heart labeled Riverside Elementary, visually demonstrating how different cultures had come together to create their unique community. Mrs. Chen's son had organized his friends into what they called food tour guides, helping younger students navigate the festival and try new things. She overheard him explaining to a hesitant first grader, "Being different isn't weird, it's like having a superpower. You have special things to share that nobody else has." As the afternoon progressed, families who had once felt marginalized were now at the heart of the celebration. Children who had hidden their lunches were proudly explaining their traditional foods to their peers. The atmosphere was one of genuine curiosity and appreciation. The hospital where Mrs. Chen worked had sent representatives to learn about the Healing Through Heritage program she had helped develop. They were particularly interested in how cultural awareness could improve patient care and community health outcomes. Near the end of the festival, Mr. Patel gathered everyone for a special announcement. The school board had officially adopted a new cultural inclusion policy, named the Riverside Protocol, which would protect and celebrate cultural differences in all district schools. The policy specifically addressed food-based discrimination and provided guidelines for creating inclusive educational environments. But the real change, Mr. Patel said, isn't in the policies we write. It's in the conversations we have, the understanding we build, and the respect we show for each other's traditions and beliefs. Our children have been our greatest teachers in this journey. As if to prove his point, a group of students had prepared a surprise presentation. They had created a video featuring interviews with their families, sharing stories about their cultural traditions and favorite meals. The interviews were interspersed with clips from their new lunchtime routine, showing how the cafeteria had become a place of cultural exchange and friendship. The video ended with a simple message: every lunchbox tells a story. Every story matters. As the festival wound down and families began to leave, Mrs. Chen found a quiet moment to sit with her son. He was tired but happy, his face still showing traces of the various foods he'd sampled throughout the day. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, "remember when I used to wish I could have normal lunches like everyone else?" She nodded, remembering those difficult days that now seemed so long ago. "I'm glad you helped me see that normal isn't just one thing," he continued. "It's like what we learned in science class about rainbows, normal is all the colors together, not just one color by itself." Mrs. Chen hugged her son close, marveling at how children could often express profound truths in the simplest ways. What had started as a mother's discovery of lunchtime discrimination had evolved into a movement that was changing schools across the state. But more importantly, it had changed hearts and minds, teaching children and adults alike that diversity wasn't something to be hidden or ashamed of, it was something to be celebrated. As they walked to their car, the setting sun casting long shadows across the school grounds, Mrs. Chen thought about how a single moment of courage could spark lasting change. The lunch boxes that had once been sources of shame had become symbols of pride and cultural exchange. The cafeteria that had once divided students now united them. And a community that had once been silent had found its voice. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a mother's surprise visit to her son's school lunch period.